Today, we will talk about one of the best trading patterns in trading history, the swing failure pattern. In the first section, I'll explain all the details of the swing failure pattern and how to identify it without a problem. In the next section, I'll talk about different styles of this pattern and the quality checkpoints to find out high-quality swing failure patterns from weak ones. In the final section, we'll look at different entry styles, how to identify the best entries, best targets, and best stop-loss points. If you're ready, let's start. We are about to complete 20% of our free price action trading course. Today we will cover the swing failure pattern. If you are looking for a structured table of contents, I set it up for you. You can find it on Google Drive or directly from my website, which is in the description. And please try to watch videos in order, otherwise you may get confused. Okay, let's learn this simple and extremely powerful trading pattern. Our current swing should not have a closing candlestick above our previous swing point. The general key point is all the closing candlesticks should be below the previous swing point. Instead, we should only see the wicks, not bodies. Why? Because this is a liquidity hunt. We assume that price comes here to only hunt the stop losses from a previous swing point. Let's see a simple example here. As you can see, the price makes major swings, but the last swing point cannot make a close above the previous swing point. There are only wicks or tails. This is what we call a weakness in the trend. So we have to wait for the candlestick close to understand if it is a swing failure pattern or not. Let's learn what the swing failure pattern really is. It's actually a weak and low quality break, but nothing else. What was a high quality break? Price strongly breaks the previous swing point with large candlesticks, most of the time with imbalances. When we see this, we assume that this is a trend continuation. Price breaks here to continue upwards. So swing failure pattern actually is a weak break of structure, BOSS, or a weak market structure break, MSB, but nothing else. When we see this pattern, we assume that this is a trend weakness, loss of momentum. I immediately think about it. Price comes here to hunt stop losses. This could be a possible trend reversal point. Of course, nothing is simple like this. We'll talk about how to enter a trade with a swing failure pattern soon. In this example, you can easily witness that price keeps breaking previous swing highs strongly, creating new break-off structures. However, in the last part, you can notice that the price cannot break the previous swing point. This is also a break-off structure, but this is a weak one. No candlestick closes above the previous swing high point, only long wicks or shadows. This is why we call this swing failure pattern, because it fails to break the previous swing high or low. Let's understand 4 different conditions. You already understand the first condition, the real swing failure. You can call it pure or real SFP. But what if the price goes above a tiny amount and the next candle strongly falls? Is this a swing failure? Well, this is not a real swing failure. But what I do always say, do not focus on names, patterns, or structures. Only focus on the meaning of the charts. If price comes here and cannot break it above strongly, but goes above a tiny amount and closing a candlestick, then drops sharply with the next candlestick, I would say this is a stop-loss hunt action, a liquidity grab. I can call it a considerable swing failure pattern, CSFP. In the next case, the price struggles too much to break it above. This time is different. If the price breaks above a tiny amount and struggles too much around the previous swing point, it means that orders are accumulating. With the accumulation of orders, price can move in either direction strongly. I would not say this is a trend weakness or an indication of a strong trend continuation. This is kind of a gray area and you should be extra careful about it. The last condition is that you already know: strong and high quality break. This is the simple part. I would not say this is swing failure or a pure stop loss hunt. This generally indicates that the price is trying to continue its trend, a sign of strength. Let's talk about 3 different quality checkpoints of the swing failure pattern and then move to half the interest rate with SFP. First of all, you'll witness this pattern almost everywhere in the chart, from major swings to internal swings. It is backtested and proven that with major and the most obvious swing points, it performs better. Support and resistance flips also work great with this pattern. I want to repeat this again. You are missing so many trade opportunities by not using support resistance flips. This is one of the best price action structures that you'll find in so many trades, especially when combined with breaker blocks. Right after a SR flip, you'll mainly witness a couple of bounces. These are great areas to look for swing failure patterns to trade. It makes the trades much more secure. The last quality checkpoint is combining swing failure with demand or supply zones. As you remember our layer system, combining price action with other structures makes the price action setup much stronger. A swing failure pattern without any other price action setup will be weaker and full of traps. Let's talk about entry models that you can use on high time frames and low time frames. The classic entry model that you will find on the internet is to wait for the candlestick to close and confirm swing failure. Then make an entry with the price level that the candlestick closes. However, I find this entry model extremely dangerous and unknown. We have no idea about the next candlestick at all. Let's see a couple of examples. In this first example, the first thing you should notice is that the price breaks down really strongly, then starts to pull back. It creates imbalance and premium discount zones. Price comes back, touches the imbalance and falls. However, it does not fully fill the imbalance yet. On the second try, the price comes back to the premium zone, fills the imbalance. It cannot break above the previous swing high point, and there is no candlestick close above it. This is a swing failure pattern. This could be an ideal entry. Stop loss should be above the wick, giving us room to breathe. And the target will be the liquidity areas like equal lows or highs or big imbalances that are waiting to be filled. Let's check out a support resistance flip example. First of all, you can easily notice the very clear support resistance flip area. Once the price level was a very strong support, turns into resistance with the strong break. And this break leaves a giant imbalance behind. As you can see, price ranges a bit, creating equal highs. With this pin bar candlestick, it clears all the stop losses and also taps the imbalance. This is a great entry zone. As a target, the equal lows and imbalance below are great for us to take profit. Let's talk about secure entries. Once you identify a swing failure pattern, I suggest you go in low time frames and find yourself a micro market structure break. This way, it makes it more secure and gives us a much clearer entry idea. The market structure break could happen with a swing failure pattern in the same area. But there is no guarantee for that. It can also happen later on after the swing failure pattern is confirmed. Wait for a confirmed swing failure pattern and then wait for micro market structure break in lower time frames. In this example, you can see the 1 hour time frame. A clear swing failure pattern happens. Once you open low time frame, like 5 minutes, you can see better price action setups to enter a trade and also better targets to find. As you can see, MSP happens here. It also creates our premium and discount zones. Price pullbacks to our premium zone and fills the imbalance. This is a great area to enter a trade. If you follow the price, you can also witness later on another micro MSP happens. I think you already know what to do here. We keep repeating the same practices over and over again. So opportunities are endless when you combine high and low time frames. Okay folks, I tried to teach you every secret and detail of how to trade swing failure pattern, so you can use it in your trading life. As a day trader or even scalper, I hope you subscribe to the channel and like the video. Thank you, please take care and see you soon.